The gunshot rang out like thunder, silencing the dusty street of Provo, Utah Territory, as Olivia Jameson stared down the barrels of 3 pistols aimed at her chest. It was 1873, and she'd never imagined her journey west would end like this, not with blood and smoke and terror. The stagecoach lay overturned behind her, its driver slumped against a wheel, and the other female passengers huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "Ain't personal, ladies," drawled the tallest bandit, his face hidden behind a bandana speckled with grime and sweat. "Just hand over them valuables and we'll be on our way." That's when she saw him. Like a mirage emerging from the heat waves, a lone rider appeared at the edge of town, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the setting sun. As he approached, his horse's hooves kicked up clouds of amber dust, each step deliberate, unhurried. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Mason," the rider called out, his voice deep and steady as he pulled his horse to a stop between the bandits and the women. His shadow stretched long across the dirt, so large it seemed to swallow the fear that had gripped them all. Olivia couldn't see his face beneath the wide brim of his hat, but she felt a curious calm wash over her as he dismounted. This stranger had just placed himself between them and certain death, and somehow, impossibly, she believed they might survive this day after all. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" the bandit named Mason spat, his finger tensing on the trigger. The cowboy pushed back his hat, revealing eyes the color of a storm-darkened sky. "The name's Hayes Flynn, and I reckon you boys have a choice to make." Olivia held her breath, caught in the space between terror and hope, unaware that this moment would forever alter the course of her life. Hayes Flynn had been riding for 3 days straight, his body aching from the saddle and his mind weary from solitude. At 30 years old, he'd seen enough of the untamed West to know that trouble often found those who weren't looking for it. He'd left behind a failed silver mine venture in Colorado, his pockets nearly empty save for the few dollars he'd earned doing odd jobs along the way to Utah Territory. Provo wasn't his final destination, truth be told. He wasn't sure where he was headed anymore, but the sound of a woman's scream had drawn him to the edge of town just as the stagecoach was being robbed. Something in him couldn't ride away. Not this time. "Mason," he repeated, recognizing the notorious bandit from wanted posters he'd seen in Denver. "Last I heard, there's a $500 bounty on your head, dead or alive." The bandit's eyes narrowed. "And what are you, some kind of bounty hunter?" Hayes shook his head. "Just a man who doesn't like seeing ladies threatened. Now, why don't you and your boys turn around and ride out while you still can?" He kept his right hand hovering near the revolver at his hip. He wasn't the fastest gun in the West, but he'd survived this long by being smart, by reading men better than they read themselves. The bandit to Mason's left, a wiry man with a patchy beard, shifted nervously. "Mason, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Red," Mason snapped. "This man is bluffing. 1 against 3. He's a dead man." Olivia watched the exchange with her heart hammering against her ribs. Her life in Boston hadn't prepared her for this kind of danger, but the last year had taught her more about survival than the previous 22 combined. After her father's death and the discovery of his substantial debts, she'd been forced to accept her cousin's invitation to come west and teach at the newly established school in Provo. "Please," she whispered, finding her voice at last. "We have little of value, just take it and go." Mason's cruel smile widened. "Oh, I intend to, miss, and maybe I'll take something else too." The words had barely left his lips when Hayes moved, drawing his revolver in one fluid motion and firing a shot that knocked the gun from Mason's hand. The bandit howled in pain as blood spurted from his knuckles. "Next one won't be so friendly," Hayes warned, his gun now trained on the second bandit. What followed was a blur of motion and sound. The third bandit fired wildly, his bullet splintering the wood of the overturned stagecoach inches from Olivia's head. She dropped to the ground, dragging the older woman beside her down as well. Hayes fired twice more, and one of the bandits fell from his horse with a strangled cry. Mason and the remaining outlaw wheeled their horses around, dust billowing behind them as they fled toward the outskirts of town. "You're dead, Flynn," Mason shouted over his shoulder. "You hear me? Dead." Then they were gone, leaving only the wounded bandit groaning in the street. Olivia rose shakily to her feet, brushing the dust from her skirts. Her traveling companions, Mrs. Winslow, a widow traveling to join her son, and the young Miller sisters, headed to their uncle's ranch, emerged trembling from behind the stagecoach. Hayes dismounted quickly, checking first on the stagecoach driver. "He's alive," he announced, his fingers pressed to the man's neck. "Bullet just grazed him." "Thank the Lord," Mrs. Winslow murmured, clutching her handbag to her chest. Hayes turned his attention to the women, his gaze lingering on Olivia. "Are you ladies all right?" Olivia nodded, though her legs felt like they might give way beneath her. "Thanks to you, Mr. Flynn." She extended a shaking hand. "Olivia Jameson, I don't know how to thank you properly." His palm was rough with calluses as it enveloped her smaller hand, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. "No need for thanks, Miss Jameson. Just doing what needed doing." By now, townspeople were emerging from the buildings along the main street, drawn by the commotion. A balding man with a silver star pinned to his vest hurried toward them. "Sheriff Parker," Hayes nodded in greeting, releasing Olivia's hand. The sheriff surveyed the scene with a grim expression. "Mason Blackwell's gang, 2 got away. Mason and one other." "This one's still breathing," Hayes indicated the wounded bandit. "We'll get him locked up." The sheriff signaled to 2 men who began lifting the outlaw. He turned to Hayes with a curious expression. "You passing through or staying, Flynn?" Hayes hesitated, his eyes flicking briefly to Olivia before he answered. "Was just passing through, but seems I might have some unfinished business now." Olivia felt an unexpected flutter in her chest at his words. "Mason made threats," she supplied. "He said he'd be back." The sheriff frowned. "Then I reckon we've got trouble coming. Mason Blackwell doesn't make idle threats." He looked at Hayes thoughtfully. "Town could use a man who can handle a gun like you." Hayes shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not a lawman, Parker, didn't say you were, but we could use the help all the same." The sheriff glanced at the sky, which was darkening rapidly. "Let's get these ladies somewhere safe for the night. Miss Jameson, you headed to the schoolhouse?" Olivia nodded. "Yes, I'm to be the new teacher." "Then we'll get you settled there, Mrs. Winslow. The Miller girls, you can all stay at the boarding house tonight. Town will cover it, considering the circumstances." As they walked toward the center of town, Olivia found herself beside Hayes. She studied him from the corner of her eye, the strong line of his jaw, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. He'd saved her life without hesitation, placing himself in danger for strangers. "Have you been to Provo before, Mr. Flynn?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Once, years ago," he replied. "It's grown some since then." "And what brings you back?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Just following the trail, Miss Jameson. Never planned on stopping." He glanced at her. "What about you? Boston's a long way from Utah territory." Surprise flickered across her face. "How did you know I'm from Boston? Your accent, and those shoes aren't made for western dust." His observation was without mockery, simply matter of fact. Olivia laughed softly, the sound strange even to her own ears after the terror of the last hour. "You're observant, Mr. Flynn. I came because there are opportunities here that I couldn't find back east after my father died." She trailed off, not wanting to burden a stranger with her troubles. Hayes nodded as if he understood what she couldn't say. "Fresh starts are worth something, that's certain." They reached the small white schoolhouse at the edge of town. It was modest but well built, with large windows to let in the light and a small living quarters attached to the back. Sheriff Parker unlocked the door. "Town council had it prepared for your arrival. It's not fancy, but it's solid. I'll have my deputy keep an eye on the place tonight, just to be safe." Olivia stepped inside, taking in the rows of simple desks, the blackboard at the front of the room. Despite everything that had happened, a sense of purpose filled her. This was why she'd come so far to build something new, She turned to thank Hayes one more time, but he was already heading back down the path with the sheriff, his tall figure silhouetted against the purple dusk. Something told her their paths would cross again, and soon. That night, as Olivia unpacked her meager belongings in the small bedroom behind the schoolhouse, she found herself listening for hoofbeats, for any sign of the bandits returning. Sleep eluded her as she replayed the events of the day, especially the moment when Hayes Flynn had appeared like some avenging angel, his shadow stretched long across the dust. What kind of man risked his life for strangers? And why couldn't she stop thinking about the stormy blue of his eyes? The next morning dawned clear and bright, the events of the previous day seeming almost dreamlike in the golden sunlight streaming through her window. Olivia dressed carefully in one of her two good dresses, a serviceable navy blue with small white buttons down the front. Today she would meet the town council, and first impressions mattered. As she pinned her chestnut hair into a simple but neat arrangement, a knock at the door startled her. Her heart jumped to her throat before she reminded herself that bandits rarely announced their presence so politely. She opened the door to find a young deputy shifting awkwardly from one foot to the other. "Morning, Miss Jameson. Sheriff sent me to escort you to the meeting hall, says it ain't safe for you to be walking about alone just yet." "That's very thoughtful, deputy." "Collins, madam, Levy Collins." He couldn't have been more than 20, with freckles splashed across his nose and a badge that looked too big for his chest. Olivia smiled reassuringly at him. "Well, Deputy Collins, I appreciate the escort, just let me gather my things." As they walked through town, Olivia took stock of her new home. Provo was larger than she'd expected, with a main street lined with businesses: a general store, a dressmaker's shop, a small bank, the sheriff's office, and a saloon called the Silver Spur that already had patrons despite the early hour. Beyond the main buildings, modest houses dotted the landscape, and in the distance, mountains rose majestically against the sky. "Has there been any sign of the bandits?" she asked, unable to contain her concern. Deputy Collins shook his head. "Not yet, madam. But sheriff's got men watching the trails, and—" He hesitated. "And what? That cowboy Flynn, he's still in town, took a room at the boarding house. Word is Mason Blackwell and him have history." This piqued Olivia's interest. "What kind of history?" the deputy shrugged. "Don't rightly know. But Flynn's got a reputation as a man who can handle trouble." They reached the meeting hall, a two-story building that also served as the town's courthouse. Inside, several men in suits were gathered around a large table. They stood as Olivia entered. "Miss Jameson," a portly man with impressive mutton chop whiskers stepped forward. "I'm Mayor Hargrove. We're mighty glad you made it safely despite yesterday's unfortunate welcome." The introductions continued. Judge Wilson, a stern-faced man with spectacles, Mr. Peterson, the banker, Reverend Mills, whose kind eyes reminded Olivia of her late father, and several other prominent citizens. But it was the figure standing by the window, slightly apart from the others, who caught her attention. Hayes Flynn looked different in the daylight, less mythic but no less imposing. He'd exchanged his trail-worn clothes for a clean white shirt and dark vest, though he still wore the gun belt at his hip. "Mr. Flynn," she acknowledged with a nod. "Miss Jameson." He touched the brim of his hat. "Good to see you recovered from yesterday's excitement." Mayor Hargrove cleared his throat. "Mr. Flynn has agreed to stay on for a spell, given the circumstances. The council has appointed him as a temporary deputy, at least until this business with Blackwell is settled." Olivia couldn't help but notice the tightness around Hayes's mouth, as if the arrangement wasn't entirely to his liking. Still, he didn't contradict the mayor. The meeting proceeded with discussions of Olivia's teaching duties, her salary, modest but sufficient, and the upcoming school term set to begin in 2 weeks' time. 28 students were enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 16, and Olivia would be their sole instructor in everything from reading and arithmetic to history and basic sciences. As the meeting concluded, Mayor Hargrove patted her hand with grandfatherly affection. "We're fortunate to have you, Miss Jameson. Our children deserve education if they are to make something of this territory." "I'll do my best, sir," she promised. As the council members dispersed, Olivia found herself alone with Hayes. He stood with his hands behind his back, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm. "I didn't take you for a lawman," she said, filling the silence. A hint of a smile played at his lips. "I'm not, just buying time." "For what?" "For Blackwell to make his move." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Miss Jameson, I should warn you Mason Blackwell isn't just any outlaw, he's calculating and he holds grudges." Olivia met his gaze steadily. "Are you trying to frighten me, Mr. Flynn?" "I'm trying to prepare you. Blackwell saw you yesterday. He might think you're worth coming back for, especially if he learns you're staying in town." The implication sent a chill down her spine, but she lifted her chin. "I won't be run out of town before I've even started teaching." Hayes studied her for a long moment, and something like respect flickered in his eyes. "Then we'll just have to make sure you're protected." He offered his arm. "May I escort you back to the schoolhouse? I'd like to check the locks on your doors and windows." Olivia hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his forearm. The solid strength beneath her fingers was reassuring. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the morning sun warming the dusty street. Olivia found herself stealing glances at her companion, curious about the man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. "You said you and Blackwell have history," she ventured. Hayes's jaw tightened. "We crossed paths in Colorado. I was working a silver claim with my partner, Samuel. Blackwell and his gang jumped our camp one night, took everything we had. Samuel tried to stop them." His voice grew hard. "They shot him in the back while he was on his knees." Olivia's hand involuntarily tightened on his arm. "I'm so sorry. Been tracking Blackwell ever since, though I never expected to find him here." He glanced down at her. "Until yesterday, I figured I'd never catch up to him. Now I'm not so sure if that's good luck or bad." They reached the schoolhouse, and Hayes insisted on checking every window, door, and possible entry point. He even climbed onto the roof to inspect the chimney, much to Olivia's concern. "It'll do," he pronounced finally, dusting off his hands. "But I'd feel better if you stayed at the boarding house for a few days, at least until we're sure Blackwell has moved on." Olivia shook her head. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Flynn, but I need to prepare the schoolhouse for the children. There are books to unpack, lessons to plan." Hayes looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have told him it would be futile. Instead, he said, "Then I'll be checking on you regular-like, and if you hear or see anything suspicious, you fire this." He pressed a small brass derringer into her hand. "One shot in the air will bring help running." Olivia stared at the weapon. She'd never held a gun before, and its weight felt foreign in her palm. "I'm not sure I could use this," she admitted. "Let's hope you won't have to." Hayes guided her hand until her finger rested properly on the trigger. "Just in case." The touch of his hands on hers sent an unexpected warmth spreading up her arms. When she looked up, she found his face closer than she'd anticipated, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the air between them charged with something unnamed. Then Hayes stepped back, clearing his throat. "I should report back to the sheriff, but I'll return this evening to check on you." Olivia nodded, suddenly unable to form words. As he turned to leave, she found her voice. "Mr. Flynn," he paused, looking back at her over his shoulder. "Thank you, not just for yesterday, but for today as well." Something softened in his expression. "Hayes, my friends call me Hayes." "Hayes," she repeated softly, testing the name on her lips. He touched his hat brim once more, then strode away, his long shadow stretching behind him in the morning sun. Olivia closed the door, pressing her back against it as her heart raced inexplicably. She'd come west seeking independence, a fresh start away from the painful memories and financial ruin her father's death had brought. Romance was the furthest thing from her mind. And yet, As she looked down at the small pistol in her hand, she couldn't deny the flutter of something unfamiliar and dangerous awakening inside her, something that had nothing to do with bandits or gunfights, and everything to do with stormy blue eyes and gentle hands. The next few days passed in a blur of activity as Olivia threw herself into preparing the schoolhouse. She scrubbed floors, arranged desks, and unpacked the precious books she'd brought with her from Boston. The town's women were quick to welcome her, bringing fresh baked bread and preserves to stock her small pantry, offering advice about the harsh Utah winters, and sharing stories about the children she would soon be teaching. True to his word, Hayes appeared each evening to check on her, his visits becoming a highlight of her days. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a jar of honey from the general store, wildflowers he'd picked on patrol, a book of poetry he'd found at the boarding house. They would sit on the schoolhouse steps as twilight descended, talking of everything and nothing while he whittled pieces of wood into delicate shapes with his pocket knife. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the son of a blacksmith, and had headed west after the war seeking adventure and fortune. He spoke of the majesty of the mountains, the vastness of the plains, the wonders he'd seen in his travels. But there were gaps in his stories, shadowed places he skimmed over, and Olivia sensed a depth of pain he kept carefully guarded. For her part, Olivia shared stories of her life in Boston, her father's work as a professor of literature, the crushing blow of discovering after his death that his gambling had left her nearly destitute. "He was a good man in most ways," she told Hayes one evening as purple shadows lengthened across the schoolyard, "but he had demons he couldn't conquer." Hayes nodded, his hands busy with a piece of pine he was shaping. "Most men do, I reckon. It's how they face them that matters." "What about your demons?" she asked softly, his hands stilled. "They ride with me wherever I go." After a moment's hesitation, he added, "Sometimes I think that's why I can't settle anywhere, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting the past to catch up." "Is that why you're so determined to find Blackwell, to put the past to rest?" Hayes looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight. "That was the plan. But lately, I've been wondering if there might be other reasons to stop running." The air between them hummed with unspoken possibility, and Olivia found herself leaning slightly toward him, drawn by some invisible force. For a breathless moment, she thought he might kiss her. Instead, he placed the wooden carving in her hand, a perfect, delicate rose. "Something beautiful for the schoolhouse," he murmured, rising to his feet. "Good night, Olivia." She watched him walk away, the wooden rose clutched tightly in her palm, her heart beating a rhythm unfamiliar and wild. That night, Olivia dreamed of gunshots and bandits, of Hayes standing between her and danger, his shadow stretching impossibly long across the dusty ground. She woke with a start, certain she'd heard something outside her window. Pulling her shawl around her shoulders, she peered into the darkness. The moonlight cast silver patterns across the schoolyard, revealing nothing out of place. Still, a prickle of unease raised the hair on her neck. She reached for the derringer Hayes had given her, its weight somewhat more familiar after he'd shown her how to hold and aim it properly. The cool metal was reassuring against her palm as she moved cautiously through the darkened schoolroom toward the front door. A soft, scratching sound from the back of the building froze her in place. Someone was trying the lock on the rear entrance. Heart pounding, Olivia backed toward the front door. She needed to fire the warning shot to summon help. But what if it was just an animal or the wind? She hesitated, not wanting to cause alarm unnecessarily. The decision was made for her when a crash echoed through the building, the sound of glass breaking. Without further hesitation, Olivia flung open the front door and fired the derringer into the air, the report shockingly loud in the quiet night. She ran into the yard, bare feet slapping against the cool dirt, not daring to look back. She'd made it halfway to the main street when a figure appeared in front of her, materializing from the shadows. A scream built in her throat until the figure spoke. "Olivia." Hayes's voice was urgent, concerned. "Someone's breaking in," she gasped, pointing back toward the schoolhouse. "Through the rear window." Hayes drew his revolver, pushing her gently behind him. "Stay here." "No," she clutched his arm. "Don't go alone." The protest had barely left her lips when more figures appeared: Sheriff Parker and Deputy Collins, alerted by the gunshot. They converged on the schoolhouse, Hayes taking the lead while the others circled around back. Olivia hugged herself, shivering in the night air as neighbors emerged from nearby houses, lanterns held high. She should have felt embarrassed, standing there in her nightgown with her hair loose around her shoulders, but fear overrode propriety. Minutes stretched like hours before Hayes emerged from the schoolhouse, holstering his weapon. His expression was grim as he approached her. Whoever it was, they're gone, but they left this. He held out a piece of paper, the edges torn as if it had been ripped from a book. In the flickering lantern light, Olivia read the crude message scrawled across the page. "Flynn's woman dies first." A cold dread settled in her stomach. "Blackwell," Hayes nodded grimly. "Has to be. He's letting me know he's watching, using you to get to me." Sheriff Parker joined them, his face lined with concern. "Miss Jameson can't stay here tonight, not safe." "She'll come to the boarding house," Hayes said firmly. "I'll take the room next to hers." The sheriff nodded agreement. "I'll post Collins outside for good measure." Olivia found her voice at last. "I should gather some things." "We'll go together," Hayes said, his tone brooking no argument. Inside the schoolhouse, the broken window had already been covered with a spare board. While Hayes checked the remaining entries, Olivia hastily packed a small bag with essentials. Her hands trembled as she stuffed in a nightgown, a fresh dress, her hairbrush. "It's my fault," she said quietly when Hayes returned to the bedroom. "If I hadn't come here, if you hadn't protected me that day—" "Don't," Hayes interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Blackwell was always going to come after me. That's who he is. If anything, I've brought this danger to your door, not the other way around." He stepped closer, hesitating before lightly touching her cheek. "I won't let him hurt you, I promise you that." The tenderness in his touch nearly undid her. Olivia leaned into his palm for just a moment, drawing strength from his steady presence. "I believe you," she whispered. The walk to the boarding house was tense, with Hayes scanning the shadows constantly, his hand never far from his gun. Mrs. Tompkins, the boarding house proprietor, was waiting for them despite the late hour, her gray hair in a hastily arranged bun, her robe belted tightly around her ample middle. "Got the rooms ready," she announced, leading them upstairs. "Connecting like you asked, Sheriff. Miss Jameson here, Mr. Flynn there." She unlocked two adjacent doors. "Breakfast at 7 sharp. Don't be late or you'll go hungry." Despite the circumstances, Olivia had to smile at the woman's no-nonsense attitude. It was oddly comforting, this small piece of normalcy amidst the chaos. Hayes checked both rooms thoroughly before pronouncing them acceptable. "Lock your door," he instructed Olivia. "And the connecting door too, if you prefer," she shook her head. "No, leave it unlocked, in case you need me," he finished, understanding in his eyes. "I'll be right there, just call out." Alone in the unfamiliar room, Olivia sank onto the edge of the narrow bed. The events of the night played through her mind in a terrifying loop. Blackwell was using her to get to Hayes. "Flynn's woman," the note had said, as if she belonged to him. The thought should have offended her independent sensibilities, but instead it stirred something warm and dangerous in her chest. In just a few short days, Hayes Flynn had become central to her world, his presence a comfort she was coming to depend on. She changed into her nightgown and climbed beneath the covers, but sleep eluded her. Every creak of the boarding house timbers, every rustle of wind against the windows had her tensing, listening for danger. After an hour of restless tossing, she rose and padded to the connecting door. It opened silently at her touch. Hayes sat in a chair by the window, his revolver on the small table beside him, his body outlined by moonlight. He turned at the sound of the door. "Olivia, what's wrong?" "I can't sleep," she admitted. "I keep hearing things." He rose and guided her to sit on the edge of his bed, It's just the old building settling, and Deputy Collins is right outside." "I know it's foolish," she said, wrapping her arms around herself. "I've never been a fearful person." "There's nothing foolish about being afraid when there's real danger," Hayes said. "Being brave isn't about not feeling fear, it's about feeling it and doing what needs doing anyway." Olivia looked up at him, struck by the wisdom in his words. "Like you did that day with the stagecoach." "You must have been afraid, facing 3 armed men," a smile ghosted across his lips. "Terrified, but sometimes the alternative, walking away, leaving folks in trouble, that's scarier still." "Why?" she asked softly. "Because then you have to live with yourself afterward." His voice dropped to a near whisper. "And that's a harder thing than facing any gun." In that moment, Olivia saw beyond the capable exterior to the man beneath, one who carried burdens of conscience and honor, who understood the weight of choices. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. "You're a good man, Hayes Flynn." He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles. "I've tried to be, not always succeeded. You succeeded with me," she said. "You saved my life." Their eyes met and held, and Olivia felt the air grow thick with unspoken feelings. Hayes lifted their joined hands slowly, pressing his lips to the back of hers in a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. "You should go back to your room," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It wouldn't be proper you being here." Propriety was the furthest thing from Olivia's mind, but she nodded, reluctantly withdrawing her hand from his. "Will you be able to sleep at all?" "I'll keep watch a while longer," he replied. "Don't worry about me." She paused at the connecting door. "Hayes, thank you for everything," he nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, Olivia." Back in her own room, she pressed her fingers to the spot his lips had touched, the sensation still tingling on her skin. For the first time since arriving in Provo, Olivia allowed herself to acknowledge the truth: she was falling in love with Hayes Flynn. And it terrified her more than any bandit ever could. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the terror of the previous night seeming almost dreamlike in the cheerful sunlight streaming through the boarding house windows. Olivia dressed in her best blue dress, determined not to let fear rule her day. Hayes was waiting for her in the dining room, deep in conversation with Sheriff Parker. Both men stood as she entered. "Miss Jameson," the sheriff greeted her. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Quite recovered, thank you," she replied with more confidence than she felt. "What news of our unwelcome visitor?" The men exchanged glances before Hayes answered. "We found tracks leading away from town, 3 horses headed east toward the mountains." "Blackwell's watching the town," Sheriff Parker added grimly, waiting for his moment. Olivia refused to let her fear show. "Well, he shall have to wait a very long time. I have a school to prepare and children arriving in 1 week's time." Hayes's expression softened with something like admiration. "The sheriff and I have been discussing security arrangements. You'll stay here at the boarding house for now, and we'll escort you to and from the schoolhouse each day." Under normal circumstances, Olivia might have protested such restrictions on her independence. But the memory of that threatening note was still fresh, and she nodded acceptance of their plan. After breakfast, Deputy Collins escorted Olivia to the schoolhouse while Hayes and the sheriff rode out to check the surrounding area for any sign of the bandits. The young deputy was eager to please but clearly nervous, his hand never straying far from his pistol as they walked. "Been with the sheriff long, Deputy Collins?" Olivia asked, trying to put him at ease. "Just 6 months, madam," he replied, his freckled face flushing slightly. "Sheriff took a chance on me after my pa died, says I've got good instincts, just need seasoning." "I'm sure you'll make an excellent lawman," she said kindly. "Not like Flynn, though," Collins said with undisguised admiration. "You should have seen him this morning, tracking those horse prints, like he could read the dirt itself." Olivia smiled, not surprised that Hayes had made such an impression on the young deputy. He seemed to have that effect on everyone he encountered. At the schoolhouse, Olivia found the broken window already repaired, likely the work of neighbors who had rallied to help. A bouquet of wildflowers sat on her desk, alongside a fresh-baked apple pie. A note from Reverend Mills's wife explained that the town women had organized a rotation to bring Olivia meals until this dreadful business was resolved. The thoughtfulness brought tears to her eyes. For all its dangers, Provo was showing itself to be a community that cared for its own, and somehow, in just a few short days, they had come to consider her one of them. She spent the morning arranging books and planning lessons, pushing thoughts of danger to the back of her mind. By midday, she had almost convinced herself that life could proceed normally despite Blackwell's threats. That illusion shattered when Hayes burst through the schoolhouse door, his face grim. "We need to go now." "What's happened?" Olivia asked, rising from her desk. "Blackwell hit a farm about 5 miles out," Hayes said, already gathering her things. "Killed the farmer, took his wife." Horror washed over Olivia. "Oh God, who? The Jensen place. Sheriff's organizing a posse, but they left a note." His jaw tightened as he handed her a folded paper. With trembling fingers, Olivia opened it. The message was brief but chilling. "An eye for an eye, Flynn. A woman for a woman. Come alone or the farmer's wife dies screaming." "He's using Mrs. Jensen to draw you out," Olivia whispered, understanding dawning. "Because of me." Hayes took her hands in his grip firm. "This isn't about you, Olivia. It's about me and Blackwell. It always has been." His eyes held hers intently. "But I need to know you're safe while I deal with this." "What are you going to do?" "What I have to." He released her hands and strode to the window, his back rigid with tension. "The sheriff wants to move you to his house. His wife will stay with you while we go after Blackwell." "You can't go alone," Olivia protested. "The note, I'm not planning to follow his instructions to the letter," Hayes said, turning back to her with a hint of grim humor. "But I need to end this one way or another." Fear clutched at Olivia's heart. "He'll kill you. He'll try." There was such quiet certainty in his voice that Olivia felt a chill run through her. This was a side of Hayes she hadn't seen before the hunter, the man who had tracked Blackwell across territories seeking justice for his murdered partner. Before she could respond, Sheriff Parker arrived with his wife, a kindly woman with silver-streaked hair and capable hands. Mrs. Parker immediately took charge, gathering Olivia's belongings with brisk efficiency. "You'll be quite comfortable at our home, dear," she assured Olivia. "And much safer than here." As they prepared to leave, Hayes pulled Olivia aside. "Stay with the sheriff's wife. Don't go anywhere alone, no matter what you hear." Hayes. She couldn't find words for the fear choking her. He seemed to understand anyway. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly across her skin. "I'll come back," he promised softly. "There's something here worth coming back for." The tenderness in his eyes made her breath catch. For a suspended moment, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Sheriff Parker called from outside, and the moment broke. Hayes let his hand fall away, his expression shifting back to determined resolve. "Be careful," Olivia whispered, reaching up impulsively to straighten his bandana. "Please." He nodded once, then strode out to join the sheriff and the gathering posse. Olivia watched from the doorway as they mounted up, a dozen men with grim faces and loaded rifles. Hayes sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders set with purpose. As if feeling her gaze, he turned back once, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that somehow felt like both promise and farewell. Then they were gone, dust rising behind them as they rode east toward the mountains where Blackwell waited with his hostage and his vengeance. Mrs. Parker gently guided Olivia away. "Come, dear, standing here worrying won't bring them back any sooner." At the Parker home, Olivia tried to keep herself occupied, helping Mrs. Parker with household tasks and attempting to focus on finalizing her lesson plans. But her mind kept straying to Hayes, imagining him tracking through the wilderness, facing down Blackwell and his gang. "You care for him," Mrs. Parker observed as they prepared supper together. It wasn't a question. Olivia's hands stilled on the dough she was kneading. "Is it that obvious?" The older woman smiled kindly. only to another woman who knows the signs. I looked at Henry that same way when we were young. She patted Olivia's flour-dusted hand. He's a good man, your Mr. Flynn, not the settling kind usually, but I've seen how he looks at you. How does he look at me? Olivia couldn't help asking, her heart quickening. Like a man who's found something he didn't know he was searching for. Mrs. Parker resumed chopping vegetables. Henry says Flynn's got a reputation as a loner, a drifter, but there's something different about him since he rode into Provo. Something settled. Olivia felt her cheeks warm. It's too soon, she protested weakly. We barely know each other. Mrs. Parker's eyes twinkled. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the head catches up. My Henry proposed after knowing me just 10 days. And you accepted? Olivia asked, surprised, not right away. Made him court me proper for 3 whole weeks. She chuckled at the memory. But I knew from the start he was the one. Sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of long courtships, especially out here in the territories. The conversation faded as a more sobering thought occurred to Olivia. What if he doesn't come back? Mrs. Parker's expression grew serious. Then you go on, as women have always done. You teach those children, you build your life, but he'll come back, Olivia. Men like Hayes Flynn are hard to kill. Olivia prayed she was right. Night fell with no word from the posse. Olivia paced the small parlor, unable to settle, startling at every sound outside. Mrs. Parker finally persuaded her to try to sleep, showing her to a neat guest room with a patchwork quilt and a window overlooking the main street. I'll wake you if there's news, she promised, but sleep proved elusive. Olivia lay in the unfamiliar bed watching moonlight patterns on the ceiling, her mind filled with images of Hayes facing down Blackwell's gang. Would he be careful, or would his desire for vengeance make him reckless? And what of poor Mrs. Jensen, caught in the middle of this blood feud? It was well past midnight when the sound of horses approaching drew her to the window. Squinting into the darkness, she could make out several riders, their forms indistinct in the shadows. One broke away from the group, heading toward the sheriff's house. Olivia threw a shawl around her shoulders and hurried downstairs, reaching the front door just as a knock sounded. Mrs. Parker emerged from her bedroom, a robe hastily pulled over her nightgown, a lamp in her hand. Who is it? She called. Deputy Collins, madam. Mrs. Parker opened the door to reveal the young deputy, his face streaked with dirt and what looked like blood. Olivia's heart lurched painfully. What news, Levy? Mrs. Parker asked, holding the lamp higher. We found Mrs. Jensen, he replied, removing his hat. She's shaken up something fierce but alive. Doc's with her now, and the others. Olivia couldn't keep the tremor from her voice. The sheriff, Mr. Flynn. Collins hesitated, and Olivia felt her world tilt dangerously. The sheriff's fine, madam. Got a bullet graze on his arm, but nothing serious. And Hayes, she pressed, her fingers digging into the doorframe for support. He went after Blackwell, Collins said, shifting uncomfortably. They split off from the main group. Sheriff tried to stop him, but Flynn was determined. Said it had to end one way or another. A cold dread settled in Olivia's stomach. He went alone, after the entire gang, Collins nodded grimly. Said it was personal business, told us to bring Mrs. Jensen back to town and keep you safe. Mrs. Parker placed a steadying hand on Olivia's arm. Where, Levy? Where did he go after them? The old mining camp in Eagle Canyon. It's where they were holding Mrs. Jensen. Collins twisted his hat in his hands. Sheriff's getting together some men to follow, but it'll be morning before they can head out. The horses are spent and it's too dangerous to track in the dark. But Hayes is out there now, Olivia said, her voice rising. Alone against how many? 3 that we know of, Blackwell and 2 others. Collins looked miserable. Miss Jameson, I'm sorry. Flynn made us promise to come back to make sure you were protected. Olivia turned away, fighting back tears of frustration and fear. Hayes had gone to face his demons alone, perhaps to die alone, all while ensuring her safety first. Mrs. Parker thanked the deputy and closed the door, then turned to Olivia with understanding eyes. There's nothing to be done tonight, dear. We must wait and pray. But waiting had never been Olivia's strong suit. As she returned to her room, a plan was already forming in her mind. If Hayes thought he could sacrifice himself for her safety, he was about to discover just how stubborn a Boston schoolteacher could be. She waited until the house was quiet, Mrs. Parker's soft snores drifting from the main bedroom. Moving silently, Olivia dressed in her sturdiest clothes, a plain skirt, sturdy boots, and a wool shawl. She had no experience with horses or wilderness travel, but she had something perhaps more valuable: determination and the element of surprise. Slipping out the back door, she made her way to the livery stable where she knew the town's horses were kept. The stable boy, a teenager named Billy whom she'd met her first day in town, was sleeping on a pile of hay. "Billy," she whispered, shaking his shoulder gently. "Wake up, I need your help." The boy blinked groggily. "Miss Jameson, what are you doing here?" "I need a horse," she said, pressing a silver dollar into his hand, nearly a quarter of her monthly salary. "And directions to Eagle Canyon." Billy's eyes widened. "But that's where I know," she interrupted. "Please, Billy." "It's important." Perhaps it was the urgency in her voice, or perhaps it was simply the allure of the silver dollar, but Billy nodded. "I'll saddle Daisy for you. She's gentle but sure-footed. But Miss Jameson, Eagle Canyon is dangerous even in daylight. You can't go alone at night." "I have to," she said simply. Billy must have seen something in her expression that discouraged further argument. He saddled the horse, a dappled gray mare with kind eyes, and gave her detailed directions, along with a small sack of provisions and a battered old pistol. "It was my pa's," he explained, showing her how to load and fire it. "Bring it back when you return, and Miss Jameson, be careful. There's mountain lions up in those canyons, not to mention Blackwell's gang." Olivia thanked him, tucking the pistol into her skirt pocket and mounting the horse with more confidence than she felt. As a child, she'd had riding lessons in Boston's public gardens, but a gentle trot around a manicured park was a far cry from navigating wilderness trails in the dark. Still, Daisy seemed to sense her rider's inexperience and moved with careful steadiness as they left town, following the eastern trail toward the mountains. The moon provided enough light to see by, and Olivia kept the pistol close at hand, jumping at every rustle in the underbrush. What was she doing? The question echoed in her mind as Daisy picked her way along the increasingly rugged trail. She had no plan beyond finding Hayes, no idea what she would do if she encountered Blackwell or his men. But the thought of Hayes facing them alone, perhaps dying alone while believing he was protecting her, was unbearable. The night air grew cooler as they climbed, the trail narrowing as it wound between towering rock formations. According to Billy's directions, Eagle Canyon was marked by a distinctive split in the cliffs that resembled a bird's outstretched wings. In the daylight, it would be easy to spot. In the moonlight, shadows played tricks, making every crevice and outcropping look potentially significant. Olivia had almost convinced herself she was hopelessly lost when Daisy suddenly stopped, her ears pricking forward. A soft, nickering sound came from somewhere ahead. Another horse. Heart pounding, Olivia dismounted and tied Daisy to a stunted pine tree. If it was one of Blackwell's men, she needed the element of surprise. Moving as quietly as she could, she crept forward, the pistol clutched in her sweating palm. A clearing opened before her, illuminated by moonlight. A single horse was tethered to a tree, a familiar chestnut gelding that Olivia recognized as the mount Hayes had been riding. Relief washed through her. She had found the right place, but where was Hayes? She scanned the clearing, seeing no sign of him or anyone else. Then she noticed a narrow trail leading up toward a dark opening in the cliff face. A mine entrance, of course. The old mining camp Collins had mentioned. Hayes must have tracked Blackwell there. Olivia hesitated, fear warring with determination. The sensible thing would be to wait for the sheriff's posse, to let them handle this dangerous confrontation. But dawn was hours away, and Hayes was in there now, possibly outnumbered, definitely in danger. Drawing a deep breath, she started up the trail toward the mine entrance. She had no plan beyond finding Hayes and warning him that he wasn't alone, that help was coming. Perhaps the element of surprise would be enough to give him an edge against Blackwell. The mine entrance loomed before her, a black maw in the mountainside. Olivia paused, straining to hear any sound from within. For a moment, there was only silence. Then a muffled shout echoed from the darkness, followed by what could only be a gunshot. Fear forgotten, Olivia plunged into the mine, guided only by the faint glow of what must be lantern lights somewhere ahead. The tunnel was low and narrow, forcing her to duck her head and feel her way along the rough wall. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic blood. Another gunshot rang out closer now, accompanied by a man's pained cry. Olivia's heart lurched, recognizing Hayes's voice even in that sound of agony. She broke into a stumbling run, no longer caring about stealth or caution. The tunnel widened into a larger chamber, dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a support beam. The scene before her froze Olivia in her tracks. Hayes was on his knees, blood darkening his left shoulder, his face contorted with pain but his eyes blazing with defiance. Standing over him was a tall man with a scarred face whom Olivia recognized as Mason Blackwell, a revolver pointed at Hayes's head. Two other men stood nearby, one nursing what appeared to be a gunshot wound to his leg. "I've been waiting a long time for this, Flynn," Blackwell was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the confined space. "Ever since Colorado, you cost me two good men." "You murdered my partner," Hayes replied, his voice steady despite his injury. "Samuel never even drew his gun." Blackwell shrugged. "Business is business, nothing personal." "It was personal to me," Hayes said. His eyes flicked briefly toward the tunnel where Olivia stood, and she saw the shock of recognition in them, quickly masked. Olivia pressed herself against the wall, her mind racing. There was no way she could overpower three armed men, even with one injured. But perhaps she could create a diversion, give Hayes a chance to act, her hand closed around the pistol in her pocket. One shot. She had to make it count. "You know what I'm going to do, Flynn," Blackwell was saying, seemingly enjoying drawing out the moment. "After I kill you, I'm going to pay a visit to that pretty schoolteacher in Provo. Show her what happens to women who take up with men like you." A cold rage filled Olivia at his words. Before she could reconsider, she stepped into the chamber, the pistol held out before her in both hands to steady her aim. "You'll do no such thing," she said, her voice remarkably steady, all heads turned toward her. Hayes's face drained of color, his expression a mix of horror and desperate concern. "Olivia, no," he breathed. "Get out of here." Blackwell recovered quickly from his surprise, a slow smile spreading across his scarred face. Well, the lady herself has come to join us. Saves me a trip to town." He gestured to one of his men. "Red, relieve the lady of her pea-shooter." "Don't move," Olivia warned, training the pistol on Blackwell's chest. "I may not be an experienced shot, but at this distance I can hardly miss." It was a bluff. She had no idea if she could actually pull the trigger, but her voice didn't waver and her hands remained steady. Blackwell studied her for a moment, then laughed. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that, but you're outnumbered, lady, and your man there is in no condition to help you." "The sheriff and his posse are right behind me," Olivia lied smoothly. "I rode ahead because I couldn't wait. They'll be here any minute." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Blackwell's face, but he covered it quickly. "Nice try." "But if that were true, they'd have come charging in with you, guns blazing." "Unless they wanted to surround the mine first," she countered. "Ensure no one escapes out some back entrance." As she spoke, Olivia was moving slowly to one side, forcing the bandits to turn away from Hayes to keep her covered. She saw understanding dawn in Hayes's eyes as he realized what she was doing. "Last chance, Blackwell," Hayes said, drawing the outlaw's attention back to him. "Surrender now and you might live to see a trial," Blackwell sneered. Big talk from a man on his knees. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. Hayes lunged sideways, tackling Blackwell around the legs despite his wounded shoulder. The outlaw's gun discharged as he fell, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling. Olivia fired her pistol at the nearest bandit, missing him but causing enough confusion for chaos to erupt. The lantern was knocked over in the struggle, plunging the chamber into near darkness save for the beam of moonlight filtering in from a shaft above. Gunshots echoed deafeningly in the confined space, muzzle flashes briefly illuminating grappling figures. Olivia pressed herself against the wall, the empty pistol useless in her hand. She could make out Hayes and Blackwell locked in a desperate struggle, rolling on the ground as each fought for control of Blackwell's revolver. A shot rang out, followed by a terrible stillness. Hayes. Olivia called, her voice breaking with fear. For an agonizing moment, there was no response. Then a groan and a figure staggered to its feet. Olivia. Hayes's voice was rough with pain but wonderfully, beautifully alive. Are you hurt? No, she managed, moving toward the sound of his voice. What about Blackwell's dead? Hayes said flatly. So is one of his men. I think the other ran. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Olivia could make out Hayes's form, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder, the other still gripping a revolver. The shape of Blackwell lay motionless on the ground beside him. Relief made Olivia's knees buckle. She stumbled forward, and Hayes caught her with his good arm, holding her tightly against his chest. What were you thinking, coming here alone? He demanded, his voice a mixture of anger and wonder. You could have been killed. I could ask you the same question, she retorted, pulling back to look up at him. Going after 3 armed men by yourself, that's not bravery, Hayes Flynn, that's foolishness. A strangled laugh escaped him. Maybe we're both fools. His expression sobered. Olivia, when I saw you standing there, I've never been so terrified in my life. Now you know how I felt, thinking of you facing them alone. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers coming away wet with what might have been blood or tears or both. I couldn't let you die for me. Hayes's arm tightened around her. I didn't want to die, I wanted to live. For the first time in years, I found someone worth living for. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Olivia's heart pounded against her ribs as Hayes lowered his head, his lips finding hers in the darkness. The kiss was tender at first, then deepening with an urgency born of survival and newfound understanding. When they broke apart, both breathless, Hayes pressed his forehead to hers. We should get out of here. That shoulder needs tending and the sheriff needs to know what happened. Can you ride? Olivia asked, suddenly concerned by the amount of blood soaking his shirt. I've ridden with worse, he assured her, though his face was pale in the moonlight. But first, I need to know something. What? Hayes cupped her face with his good hand, his eyes serious in the dim light. When this is over, when Blackwell's buried and this business is finished, will you let me court you properly? I know I'm not much of a catch, just a drifter with more past than future, but Olivia silenced him with another kiss, pouring all her feelings into it. Yes, she whispered against his lips. Yes, Hayes Flynn, I will let you court me, but on one condition. Name it, he murmured. No more lone heroics. Whatever comes next, we face it together. A smile touched his lips, transforming his weary face. Together, he agreed. I think I like the sound of that. Dawn was breaking as they emerged from the mine, Hayes leaning heavily on Olivia for support. The eastern sky was painted in hues of gold and pink, the promise of a new day spreading across the land. As they reached the clearing where the horses waited, the thunder of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of Sheriff Parker and his posse. The sheriff took in the scene with one glance: Hayes's bloodied shirt, Olivia's disheveled appearance, the absence of any pursuing bandits. Blackwell, he asked simply. Dead, Hayes confirmed. One of his men too, the other ran off wounded. The sheriff nodded, then fixed Olivia with a stern look. Mrs. Parker is beside herself with worry, young lady, slipping out in the middle of the night. What were you thinking? Olivia met his gaze steadily. That I couldn't let Mr. Flynn face those men alone. Something in her tone or expression must have conveyed more than her words, for the sheriff's stern look softened into understanding. He glanced between her and Hayes, noting how they stood together despite Hayes's injury, and a knowing smile touched his weathered face. "Well," he said gruffly, "I reckon Provo's been needing a schoolteacher with some backbone. Let's get you both back to town. Doc Williams will want to look at that shoulder." As they rode back to Provo, Hayes insisted that Olivia ride with him despite his injury, unwilling to let her out of his sight. She sat before him in the saddle, his good arm wrapped securely around her waist, his chest warm against her back. "What happens now?" she asked softly as the town came into view, golden in the morning light. Hayes's breath stirred her hair as he answered. "Now I keep my promise. I court you proper if you'll have me." Olivia leaned back against him, a contentment she had never known settling deep in her bones. "I'll have you, Hayes Flynn, for as long as you'll stay," she felt rather than saw his smile. "I reckon Provo could use a man who's good with horses. Might open a stable, train some Mustangs. Been thinking about it since I arrived." Joy bubbled up within her. "You're staying, truly." "Got something worth staying for now," he said simply, pressing a kiss to her temple. Someone, rather. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of healing and beginnings. Hayes's shoulder mended slowly under Doc Williams's care and Olivia's attentive nursing. The school term began with 28 eager students who quickly came to adore their new teacher, especially when Mr. Flynn would sometimes bring a gentle pony for the children to ride during their lunch hour. True to his word, Hayes courted Olivia properly, calling on her at the schoolhouse with flowers and small gifts, taking her for walks along the river on Sunday afternoons after church. The town watched their courtship with approving eyes, especially Mrs. Parker, who claimed credit for predicting the match from the start. The tale of how the schoolteacher had ridden alone into the mountains to save her cowboy became something of a local legend, embellished with each telling until Olivia scarcely recognized the story. But the truth was remarkable enough how a chance encounter with bandits had brought together two souls searching for something they hadn't known they were missing. Hayes purchased land on the edge of town and began building a modest house with a large stable and corral. His skill with horses quickly earned him a reputation, and soon ranchers from miles around were bringing him their most difficult animals to gentle. On a crisp autumn evening, with the leaves turning gold and crimson on the cottonwoods, Hayes brought Olivia to see the nearly completed house. He led her through the rooms, pointing out the large windows he'd installed in the bedroom to let in the morning light, the bookshelves built into the parlor wall for her growing collection. "It's perfect," she breathed, turning to him with shining eyes. Hayes took her hands in his expression suddenly serious. Not quite perfect yet. He drew a deep breath, then slowly knelt before her. "Olivia Jameson, I know I'm not the man you probably dreamed of back in Boston. I've got rough edges that might never smooth out entirely. But I love you with everything I am, and I promise to spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you. Will you marry me?" Tears spilled down Olivia's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak for the emotion clogging her throat. Hayes rose and gathered her in his arms, his kiss a seal on their promise to each other. They were married 2 weeks later in the town church, with the entire community in attendance. Sheriff Parker stood as Hayes's best man, and Mrs. Winslow, the widow from the stagecoach, acted as Olivia's matron of honor. Even Deputy Collins had a role, proudly escorting Olivia down the aisle in place of her late father. As they exchanged vows, Olivia thought back to that fateful day when the stagecoach was attacked, when a stranger had placed himself between her and danger, his shadow large enough to swallow fear. How could she have known then that in that moment of terror she had found the love of her life? When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, Hayes lifted her veil with gentle hands, his eyes filled with a love so profound it took her breath away. "Together," he whispered, an echo of the promise they'd made in the darkened mine. "Always," Olivia replied, standing on tiptoe to seal their vows with a kiss that held all the promise of their future. The townspeople's cheers faded to background noise as Hayes and Olivia Flynn began their life together. A life born from danger but built on love, courage, and the certainty that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them side by side. 5 years later, Olivia sat on the front porch of their home, watching as Hayes taught their 4-year-old son Henry to ride his first pony. The little boy's laughter rang out across the yard, his dark hair and blue eyes a perfect blend of his parents' features. Nearby, 2-year-old Margaret toddled after butterflies, her copper curls gleaming in the sunlight. So much had changed since that first frightening day in Provo. The town had grown, with a proper hotel now standing where the old boarding house had been, and a railway station bringing regular connections to Salt Lake City and beyond. Olivia still taught at the schoolhouse, though now with an assistant to help manage the growing number of students. Hayes's horse breeding business had flourished, his reputation spreading throughout the territory. But some things remained unchangeable constants: the love between them that had only deepened with time, the strength they found in each other, the life they'd built from what had begun as a chance encounter. "Mama, look," Henry called, sitting tall in the saddle as Hayes led the pony in a circle. "I'm riding like Papa." "I see you, sweetheart," Olivia called back, her heart full to bursting with pride and love. Hayes glanced up, catching her eye with a smile that still made her pulse quicken after all these years. In that smile was the memory of their beginning, the acknowledgement of how far they'd come, and the promise of all that still lay ahead. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Olivia thought of the countless sunsets they'd shared and the many more to come. She thought of the moment when a lone rider had appeared like a mirage, placing himself between danger and innocence, his shadow stretching across the dust. That shadow had been large enough to swallow fear then. Now it had expanded to shelter a family, a home, a life built on courage and devotion. And in that sheltering shadow, Olivia and Hayes Flynn had found not just safety, but the greatest adventure of all: a love that had begun in danger but would endure for all their days.